Good morning. So we finally reached it. We're finally reaching the end of the series on the book of Judges. And it's really interesting the way this book ends. And if you remember back to the very beginning of this series, Brandon talked about and showed the Bible Project video. In the last section, chapters 17 through 21, were that big black thing at the right-hand side of the video, where Israel has just morally fallen apart. There's really nothing good going on in Israel anymore. And the key phrase that we hear throughout here is, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And we really are going to see that in today's message. Now, chapters 17 through 21 really tell two stories. 17 and 18 is a short story that talks about a Levite, go figure, and how that Levite is sort of a different character. But not only that, but just the whole thing of how corrupt both the leadership in Israel and the people and the Levites has become. And we see that amplified again in chapters 19 through 21, which again is about a Levite. And it's, if you remember back from the introduction, 19 through 21 is really a depressing, horrible story. And we're going to talk through it a little bit, and I'm going to have you read some of that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell the story of 17 and 18 first, and then we're going to go and look a little bit deeper at what's happened to Israel in 19 through 21 and how that seems to be what our world is turning into today. So, the book opens in 17 and 18 with a character named Micah, whose name really means like Yahweh. And he really displays no characteristics that he's like Yahweh. He's stolen 1,100 pieces of silver from his mom, and then is only prompted to return it when his mom curses him, or curses whoever stole the money. So he gives it back. She's all happy again and blesses him. But he makes idols out of some of the silver, and then takes one of his sons and makes him a priest over his own local shrine in his house, which sounds sort of strange because none of that is godly, and none of that is what he should be doing. In theory, he should be going to the Levites and giving them the money and working with them. But speaking of Levites, now a Levite shows up. And there's this young Levite who's wandering around looking for sustenance, looking for somebody to help take care of him because he has nothing. Now, apparently he's come from Bethlehem, but not quite sure why he was in Bethlehem, considering that he is supposed to be in one of the towns in the local area. And Bethlehem was not part of his lineage. So the Levites were established in specific towns, and this particular Levite was supposed to be in a different set of towns, but other than Bethlehem. But he's wandering around looking for something, and he reaches Micah's house, and Micah greets him and basically offers to pay him to be his own local priest. So the Levite accepts. He says, "Hey, that's great. Now I've got something," and he's all happy. He's the priest over the local shrine. He's basically made a son of the family, and he's being paid for the whole thing. So he's only concerned about what he can do, what he gets. He's really not concerned about serving God because he's being a priest over top of idols. And now we have the third basic character of the story, and that's the tribe of Dan. And the tribe of Dan shows up because they never established their own home area that they were allotted when Joshua sent the tribes out to have their own areas. They're supposed to push the Canaanites out of where they were. They didn't do it like a lot of the other tribes didn't. So the Canaanites then came back and pushed them out, and now they're wandering around looking for a new place to call home. So they send out some spies who visit Micah. They see the priest there. They question the priest because they want to know really what's going on, why he's there, what he's doing. And then they ask for a prophecy from the priest as to whether or not they're going to find what they're looking for. And the priest says, "Sure, you're going to find what you want. Everything's going to work out fine." So the spies go off. They find a town called Laish, which is actually a very peaceful community. They don't have any real protection. It's basically open. It's a wonderful area, lots of food and stuff like that. But they have nothing. So the tribe of Dan decides, we're going to go back. We're going to get the whole tribe, and we're going to wipe this place out. And that's exactly what they do. They return with 600 warriors, come back to Micah's house, and at that point they take the priest and they offer him a new job to be their priest. And then they wander off to Laish and wipe out the town. And it was really a massacre. They completely wiped the whole thing out. They burned down the town, and they established their own shrines and everything, and became this new home for the tribe of Dan. But they did it at the expense of a peaceful people and community who really had done nothing and deserved nothing of what was going on. So we see moral corruption at the personal level in terms of Micah. We see moral corruption at the Levitical level, the priest and spiritual level, in terms of the Levite. And then we see it at the national level, the tribal level, where the tribe of Dan is just going out and wiping out people just because they couldn't do what they're supposed to do in the first place. So that's really what the first half of this story is about. Chapters 17 and 18 present this story and how Dan basically is trying to establish this new area. I'm going to take a quick break here. Okay, so now we're at the second story here, and this is chapters 19 through 21. And really, where we're going to spend most of our time is in chapter 19 and probably the first half of chapter 20. The rest of it it can be read, and you guys can read it all afterwards. But it's really amazing how we see the corruption of Israel in this chapter and a half of Scripture. So what we have here is a situation where there's another Levite wandering around again, and he's got a concubine. I'd like you to take some time and read chapter 19, verse 1 through chapter 20, verse 17, which is really the whole core part of this message here. And I think what I'd like you to do is, as you're reading this, put aside the horror of what's going on and think about the main characters that you see in this message. The Levite, the old man, the people of Gibeah, and the nation of Israel. And think about, do any of these people demonstrate any redeeming moral character or value? Is there any desire to please God by any of these people? But think about why or why not are these people acting like this? And the second thing I'd like you to think about is, who out of all the characters in this story, who is the main antagonist? Who's the person who's causing the most trouble and is really showing the worst character out of all the people in this story? And why do you think that person is the real problem in this story? So take some time, take a couple minutes, hit pause, and then we'll come back and take a look at this piece of the story and what's really going on and what it really means for us today. Welcome back. I'm sure that you sort of wish you hadn't had to read that piece of scripture, because there's really some terrible stuff going on. And we basically have, the four character groups that I was talking about. We have the Levite, who has a concubine. For somehow they get into an argument, and she goes off to be with her dad, and he goes and tries to get her, and then after 4 days, he's able to leave with his concubine, and he wants to go home to Ephraim, where he lives. And he passes Jerusalem, and his servants, they say, why don't we stop here? But at that time, Jerusalem was not an Israelite city. He said, no, I don't want to stay here. I want to go on to Gibeah, which was part of the tribe of Benjamin, and let's spend the night there. They get there, and they sit in the square and wait for somebody to offer them hospitality, which is something that typically happened in Israel towns. And basically, they sat there until sundown, and nobody showed up. And finally, an old man wanders in, who's actually a temporary resident there, and he sees them sitting there, and he offers them sanctuary in his house. So he takes them home. They eat. They're all happy. And suddenly, it sounds like we're back in Sodom and Gomorrah. And we're dealing with Lot and the angels. But in this case, the men of Gibeah come and they want to have sex with the Levite. And the old man steps up and says, don't do this wicked thing. Here, you can have my virgin daughter and his concubine and do what you want with them, but leave the Levite alone. And they say, no, we don't want to do this. So what happens? The Levite takes his concubine and throws her outside and lets the men of Gibeah rape and abuse her all night long. And then, wakes up in the morning. Now, he's gone to bed. He hasn't worried about it or anything. He's gone to bed. He wakes up in the morning, he opens the door, and there she is laying on the step outside the house. Apparently had just gotten there and was if she wasn't dead, she was on the verge of death. But he kicks her and says, come on, get up, we want to go. She can't do it, so he picks her up, puts her on his donkey, and goes home. So we have this Levite who, I can't even think of any good thing that he did in this whole thing. He's callous, he's self-centered, and all he thinks about is what he wants and what he needs. And we certainly have the men of Gibeah who, like I said, were much like Sodom and Gomorrah at the time. And all they wanted was to abuse and basically abuse and have sex with anybody they could get their hands on. So the Levite gets home, and what's he do? He cuts up his concubine into 12 pieces and then sends her out to each of the tribes of Israel. And this is where things get really weird, because now Israel's all up in arms. Israel gathers hundreds, thousands of warriors together, and they ask the Levite, why did you do this? And he says, and basically the Levite says, because they wanted to kill me and have sex with me, the men of Gibeah, killed my concubine, and that's why I sent her out, because this never should have happened. So he even misled and misrepresented what happened in the story. And Israel decides, we're going to deal with this, and they do a horrible job of it. They don't follow the law. They don't do what God has called them to do when they're going out. They don't check and verify the Levite story. They don't ask the Gibeonites what happens. They just go out and say, why did all your leaders do all this stuff? And so they decide to wipe out the tribe of Benjamin. And as you read the rest of the story, you can follow all the stuff that happens after this. But I want to stop here and sort of step back and look at what it was in Israel that allowed all this stuff to happen. And if you remember when we opened up, and you remember what we've talked about since the beginning of this whole thing, the biggest problem with Israel at this point was everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes. And if you look at the characters in this story, everybody was self-serving. The old man was self-serving and trying to offer off other people instead of being responsible and saying, no, you can't do that and just leave us alone. Israel was certainly that way. They didn't care about anybody but their own standing and their own look, and they were willing to wipe out a whole tribe to avenge something that they didn't even validate and make sure was true. But the worst case, and the worst one, and I think this really answers the whole thing, is the Levite was clearly morally corrupt to the core. He was self-serving. He was only concerned about himself. He only wanted what he wanted. And I think this is a reflection of the whole spiritual community in Israel at the time. All they wanted was to make money. They wanted to be important. They wanted to get what they wanted. But they didn't want to have to do what God called them to do. And I think what we're seeing today in our world is very, very similar. We're seeing people who are only concerned about what they know and what they believe and what they want, and they don't care about what other people want and what they need. and they don't care about what God has called them to do, to love your neighbor, to take care of your friends, to bless people, to look out for widows and orphans. And I think this is the message of the whole book of Judges, that as we go out and we only consider ourselves, we start forgetting everybody else in the world. We start forgetting who God is and the character of God and who He's called us to be. And we start only being concerned about ourselves and what we want and what we need. So as we go out today, as we consider the horrible story that we just read about, and the horrible story really of the book of Judges, the reason it's there is to point us to what happens after the book of Judges, which starts in 1 Samuel, where Israel gets a king. And it's not the king that we finally have. It's not King Jesus, but it's pointing us in that direction. And this whole setup that we've had in the book of Judges is now pointing us to where we should be going and where we should actually be and where we should have started from. And now we know better. Israel didn't know at the time, but now we know better. So as we close out today and as we consider the book of Judges, I think one thing we need to walk away with is we don't need to be doing what we think is right in our own eyes, but we need to be serving God and doing what is right in God's eyes, honoring His word, doing what He's called us to do, and blessing all the people around us. It's not all about us, but it is about Him. So you guys take care, have a wonderful day, have a blessed week, and God bless you all.